You know that feeling when you wake up, um, grab your phone off the nightstand and just start scrolling through the morning news?
Oh, yeah. The absolute worst way to start the day.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because suddenly you just feel completely disoriented.
Yeah.
Like you're hit with updates about these massive geopolitical summits, shifts in the global supply chain, changes to the highest laws in the land.
Right. It's just this heavy civilization level maneuvering.
Exactly. But then, right in the middle of all that dense stuff, an article pops up about how, like, your favorite bag of potato chips is losing its color.
Black and white snack bag.
Yeah. And you just sit there looking at the screen trying to figure out how a chess match between global superpowers actually trickles all the way down to the snack aisle at the local convenience store.
It's totally jarring.
It is. The daily news cycle on a day like today, May 13th, it feels like standing way too close to a pointillist painting. You see a million distinct chaotic dots, but you just cannot see the image they're supposed to form.
Well, the modern information landscape is essentially designed to do that. It presents you with isolated data points without any of the underlying scaffolding.
Right, exactly.
So we are constantly absorbing the what's of the world, like a meeting in Beijing, an incident on a train, some new piece of technology, but we are totally starved of the how and the why.
Yeah.
And without understanding the mechanisms that connect, a disruption in the Middle East to the packaging of a snack food in Tokyo, the news just feels like a barrage of random noise.
So that is exactly what we are doing today. We are going to build that scaffolding for you.
That's the mission.
We're taking the sprawling, seemingly disconnected landscape of today's news and exploring the deep, invisible mechanisms that tie it all together. We're doing a real deep dive to these sources.
And we're going to cover a lot of ground.
We really are. We'll start way up in the skies aboard Air Force One to look at the mechanics of statecraft, watch how nations anchor their economies before a storm, and examine how global tension physically alters the products you buy. And from there, we'll look at how the fundamental laws and physical infrastructures of society are being basically stress tested by human behavior, and end with a look at the neuroscience of how we experience reality itself.
It's a huge lineup, but before we jump in, it is really critical to establish our operating principle for this deep dive.
Oh, right. The disclaimer.
Yeah, because we are examining highly sensitive, politically charged developments today. We're talking about U.S., China, and Taiwan relations, proposed amendments to Japan's constitution.
Heavy stuff.
Very. So we are analyzing the functional reality of these events. We do not endorse the viewpoints presented in the content, nor do we take a side on the political outcomes.
Yeah, no sides here.
None at all. Our function is strictly to unpack the statements, the proposals, and the geopolitical physics of the day's news to help you understand how these systems operate.
Perfect. Okay, so let's look at the first mechanism, which is, right now, currently flying over the Pacific Ocean.
Air Force One.
Yes. U.S. President Trump boarded Air Force One at Andrews Air Force Base and is en route to Beijing for a summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping tomorrow.
A very high-stakes meeting.
Extremely. And before leaving the White House, Trump spoke to the press and laid out an agenda that, well, it reads less like a cohesive diplomatic strategy and more like an inventory of the world's most volatile tripwires.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. He stated he wants to thoroughly discuss the Iran situation with Xi. But then, in the very next breath, he undercut that by stating explicitly that he doesn't need anyone's help.
Specifically calling out that he does not need Xi's help.
Right. And then he threw Taiwan arms sales into the mix, mentioned energy policy, and then made this super cryptic, unelaborated claim that the end of combat in the Russian invasion of Ukraine is very close.
With zero details provided, of course.
Zero details. So my immediate reaction to this is just pure skepticism. It feels like he's holding a dozen completely different puzzle pieces. Middle Eastern security, Eastern European borders, East Asian sovereignty, and trying to jam them onto a single negotiating table in Beijing.
It's chaotic.
Yeah. I just struggle to see how transactional diplomacy actually functions when you are dealing with issues as fundamentally sensitive as Taiwanese sovereignty.
Well, the skepticism is definitely warranted, because this approach defies the traditional compartmentalized model of diplomacy that we saw dominate the late 20th century.
What do you mean by compartmentalized?
So traditional statecraft relies on siloing issues. You negotiate trade on one track, and you negotiate nuclear proliferation on a completely separate track.
Oh, to make sure they don't contaminate each other.
Exactly, to ensure that a disagreement over, say, soybean tariffs doesn't accidentally trigger a geopolitical crisis over a red line issue.
Right. That makes sense.
But what you are observing here is the absolute extreme of transactional statecraft. In a purely transactional framework, there are no silos.
Everything is on the table.
Everything. Every single issue, regardless of its ideological weight or historical sensitivity, is treated as a tradable commodity on a unified ledger.
Okay, I understand the theory of a unified ledger, but the execution here seems completely counterintuitive to me.
How so?
Well, if the goal is to negotiate a complex agreement regarding Iran, why would the opening move, before the plane even lands, be a public declaration that you absolutely do not need the other party's assistance? It fundamentally breaks the basic logic of asking for cooperation, doesn't it?
It breaks the logic of a cooperative partnership, yes. But it perfectly aligns with the logic of leverage-based negotiation.
Okay, explain that.
This is an extreme anchoring technique. In behavioral economics, anchoring is the cognitive bias, where an individual depends too heavily on an initial piece of information offered to make subsequent judgments.
Right, the anchor sets the baseline.
Exactly. And stating publicly that he does not need China's help with Iran, he is attempting to set a baseline of total independence.
Oh, wow, so he's framing it so that...
He's framing any potential cooperation from China not as a desperately needed lifeline that China can charge a huge premium for, but as a secondary optional benefit.
That's fascinating.
He is entering the negotiation attempting to owe the other party nothing, shifting the burden of offering concessions entirely onto the other side of the table.
But the flaw in that behavioral economics model, though, is that nations are not purely rational economic actors.
Not at all.
Right, they have domestic populations, national pride, and historical red lines. Which brings us to the view from Taiwan, which is the ultimate historical red line here.
It really is.
The Kuomintang, or KMT, which is Taiwan's largest opposition party, is watching this summit incredibly closely.
Yep.
The KMT chairman, who actually met with Xi in Beijing last month, gave an interview where he articulated his desired outcome for tomorrow's meeting.
And what was his demand?
He stated he hopes Trump will explicitly state his opposition to Taiwan independence, rather than merely stating that he does not support it.
Okay, to understand the massive weight of that request, we have to dissect the concept of cross-strait relations and the deliberate linguistic ambiguity that has kept the peace in that region for decades.
The exact wording matters so much.
It is everything. For years, the standard diplomatic phrasing from the U.S. has been a variation of, "We do not support Taiwan independence."
Right.
That phrase is a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. Not supporting is passive.
Yeah, it's very non-committal.
Exactly. It means the U.S. is not actively encouraging a declaration of independence, but it does not commit the U.S. to actively crushing such a movement either. It basically leaves the door open just a crack.
So the KMT chairman is asking for that door to be slammed shut and deadbolted.
Yes.
By asking for explicit opposition, he is asking the U.S. to transition from passive neutrality to active resistance against the idea of independence.
Precisely. And the reason the KMT chairman is advocating for this is rooted in his assessment of the current risk matrix.
The threat of conflict.
Yeah, he warned in the interview that cross-strait relations are deteriorating so rapidly that it is generating global anxiety about the outbreak of war. His proposed solution to de-escalate this immediate threat is to completely seal away the theoretical debate over Taiwan independence and focus entirely on promoting dialogue.
But he also had to address the other side of the equation, right? Beijing's stated long-term goal of reunification.
Right, he can't just ignore that.
No. And when he was asked about this, he used this really fascinating idiom. He said, "It takes more than one cold day for a river to freeze 3 feet deep."
It is a profound piece of rhetorical engineering.
Right, because it acknowledges the ice.
Yes. The phrase acknowledges the existence of the freezing process, which, in this metaphor, is China's goal of reunification.
Right.
By acknowledging the ice is forming, he placates Beijing, avoiding a direct confrontational rejection of their core objective. However, the operative part of the idiom is the time frame.
The 3 feet deep part.
Yes. He is emphasizing that creating 3 feet of ice requires an incredibly long, sustained period of cold.
Oh, so he's enforcing a doctrine of infinite patience.
Exactly.
He's essentially saying, look, we acknowledge your ultimate destination, but the laws of physics dictate that this journey must take generations. And any attempt to artificially speed up the freezing process will just break the ice.
That is a great way to summarize it. It is a diplomatic mechanism to avoid an immediate military crisis by keeping the dialogue open indefinitely without ever forcing a final, irreversible conclusion today.
It's basically kicking the can down the road, but brilliantly.
It is strategic deferment. And the reason this specific phrasing regarding frozen river matters to you, the listener, is because the nuance of this exact issue, how Trump and Xi navigate the space between not supporting and opposing, is the central pillar holding up the current global order.
Yeah, it affects everything.
If that pillar cracks tomorrow, the ripples will instantaneously hit global equity markets, disrupt the shipping lanes that bring advanced semiconductors to your electronics, and alter the fundamental security architecture of the entire planet.
Well, while the U.S. and China are preparing to test that pillar, we need to look at how other nations are maneuvering in the shadow of this summit.
Right, because nobody is just sitting still.
No. Japan is currently executing some really fascinating strategic maneuvers to ensure its economic and security anchors are secure before the storm hits. Prime Minister Takaichi just held a meeting with visiting U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent explicitly to reiterate Japan's stance ahead of the Trump-Xi meeting.
The timing there is definitely not coincidental.
Not at all.
When two superpowers are about to negotiate, allied nations must broadcast their alignment to prevent being used as leverage. Bessent highlighted the strong U.S.-Japan relations and specifically praised the tight cooperation with Japan's Ministry of Finance regarding exchange rate policies.
Which, the focus on exchange rates totally makes sense. Currency stability is basically a form of national defense. If the geopolitical temperature rises, you often see massive capital flight, which can destabilize a national currency overnight. So broadcasting a united financial front between the U.S. Treasury and the Japanese Ministry of Finance signals to the market and to Beijing that attempting to exploit economic vulnerabilities in the alliance will not work.
It's a financial shield wall.
Right. But then the meeting took a sudden turn that I find deeply perplexing.
The tech pivot.
Yeah. After establishing this united economic front, Prime Minister Takaichi pivoted the conversation to a highly specific piece of technology. She called for U.S.-Japan cooperation to minimize the cyber attack risks of an artificial intelligence model called Claude Mythos, developed by an American startup.
It seems like a strange venue for that discussion.
It really does.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm struggling to understand the choice here. Why is a prime minister bringing up a specific private sector AI model with the Treasury Secretary on the eve of a global superpower summit? It seems like an incredibly granular tech issue to inject into high-level macro diplomacy.
I get why you'd think that. But it only seems granular if we apply the security paradigms of the 20th century to a 21st century reality.
What do you mean?
The reason this AI model shares the agenda with national exchange rates is because the definition of a weapon and the definition of a national border has fundamentally mutated. We are dealing with dual-use technology.
Like nuclear power.
Exactly. Historically, dual use referred to things like nuclear material. It can power a city, or it can level one. The regulation of that material was the highest priority of statecraft.
But regulating uranium makes sense because it is a physical, scarce resource that requires massive industrial infrastructure to refine. Like, you can track it, you can inspect the centrifuges.
You can count the barrels, right?
Yeah.
And that is why AI terrifies modern governments.
Because you can't count it.
Generative AI models, especially the ones capable of autonomous reasoning and code generation, like the advanced iterations we're seeing now, are the new dual-use technology. They can optimize power grids and discover new pharmaceuticals, or they can be weaponized by state actors to execute localized, highly sophisticated cyber warfare, probe critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, or generate personalized mass-scale disinformation.
Which is terrifying.
And the difference is, this new uranium isn't a physical rock, it is math. It is infinitely replicable code, developed not in a heavily guarded government bunker, but in an open-plan office by a private startup in Silicon Valley.
And because it's developed by an American startup, Japan cannot regulate it unilaterally.
Right, they have no jurisdiction.
So if Claude Mythos has vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a hostile state actor to attack Japanese digital infrastructure, Japan has to ask the U.S. government to intervene with the private American company.
You have identified the exact mechanism of modern vulnerability. Prime Minister Takaichi elevating this specific AI model to the Treasury Secretary is a stark declaration that national security, economic stability, and the regulation of private tech sector algorithms are now indistinguishable from one another.
They're all the same thing now.
You cannot have a secure exchange rate if the financial institutions trading that currency are vulnerable to AI-driven cyber intrusions. The battlefield is digital, and the munitions are being manufactured by private startups.
Okay, that breakdown of the barrier between the digital realm and physical reality leads us directly into our next set of mechanisms. We've been discussing high-level abstractions, right? Transactional statecraft, dual-use algorithms, currency alignment.
The macro stuff.
Yeah, the macro stuff. But these abstractions eventually cascade down into raw, physical consequences that dictate how you live your life. I want to look at how a geopolitical abstraction forces a massive corporation to physically alter the products sitting in your local grocery store.
Ah, the physical manifestation of supply chain fragility.
Let's start with the macro-level trigger. PM Takaichi held a ministerial meeting specifically regarding the situation in the Middle East. The Japanese government announced that they have successfully secured alternative maritime routes for oil that bypass the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is a huge deal.
It is. For context, the Strait of Hormuz is essentially a geographical bottleneck, a narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman that is currently functionally blockaded due to regional tensions.
Right, and historically, a massive percentage of the world's oil flows through that tiny choke point.
Exactly. Because Japan secured alternative routes for 60% of their needs this month and over 70% next month, the government announced they will not proceed with the planned third release of their national oil stockpiles.
The decision to withhold the release of the national stockpile is a fascinating look into the calculus of state survival.
How so?
A national strategic reserve is not merely a buffer. It is the absolute final line of defense against societal collapse. Governments manage these stockpiles by constantly calculating a burn rate.
A burn rate.
Yeah, how fast they will deplete the resource versus the projected duration of the crisis.
It is a totally morbid mathematical equation. You basically have to assume that tomorrow could always be worse than today.
Exactly, because if you release the oil today to slightly lower domestic gas prices, and then the alternative shipping routes fail tomorrow, you have severely compromised your national security.
Right.
By successfully rerouting the supply chains away from the Strait of Hormuz, the government bought itself the most valuable resource in a crisis time. They get to keep the oil in the ground for a true, unmitigated emergency.
But the government's approach to stockpiles is highly targeted. In the exact same meeting, they announced they are releasing a different resource.
The medical supplies.
Yes, they are releasing 50 million medical gloves from the National Reserve this month for medical institutions. They are holding the oil because they found a workaround, but they are burning the medical supplies because the healthcare system requires immediate physical intervention.
It's a balancing act.
It really is. And this macro-level balancing act by the government is happening simultaneously with a desperate micro-level scramble by the private sector. And this is where we get to the potato chips.
The Calbee packaging shift, this is so wild.
It is so wild. So Calbee, which is one of the largest snack makers in Japan, announced that starting the week of May 25th, they are fundamentally altering the packaging for 14 of their major flagship products, including potato chips, Kappa Epicin, and Frugra.
Right.
If you are familiar with Japanese grocery stores, you know these packages are iconic.
Very colorful.
Extremely. They're vibrant, highly colorful, covered in detailed food photography, and bright cartoon mascots. But Calbee is stripping all of it away.
Just completely removing it.
Yeah. The new bags will be entirely silver-toned, featuring only stark, minimalist black and white printing. There will be no photos, no characters, and printed on the packaging will be a clear label, Petroleum Raw Material Saving Package.
The visual impact of this really cannot be overstated.
No, it's huge.
Corporations spend decades and billions of dollars optimizing brand recognition. The specific shade of red on a bag of chips is engineered to trigger a psychological response in the consumer.
Right, to make you hungry.
Yeah, exactly. For a major corporation to voluntarily obliterate its own visual identity is virtually unprecedented unless they are forced by an insurmountable physical constraint.
And the constraint is the ink. The stated reason for the change is a raw material shortage caused by the tensions in the Middle East. But I need you to break down the chemistry here for me because it blew my mind. When we think of oil, we think of gasoline or plastic. We don't usually think of the yellow ink printing a cartoon shrimp on a snack bag.
This is the hidden architecture of modern manufacturing. High-quality, vibrant commercial printing inks do not rely on water or natural dyes. They rely heavily on petroleum-derived solvents, resins, and pigments.
Wait, really?
Yes, crude oil is refined into naphtha, which is then cracked into petrochemicals that form the binding agents and the vibrant colorants required for high-speed commercial printing.
Wow.
So when the flow of oil through a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz is threatened, the price and availability of these highly specific chemical derivatives dry up almost instantly.
Which exposes the profound fragility of the just-in-time manufacturing model.
Precisely. The just-in-time, or JIT model, was pioneered to eliminate the massive costs of warehousing inventory.
Instead of just keeping a bunch of ink in a warehouse.
Right. Instead of holding millions of gallons of ink, a company relies on a perfectly synchronized, continuous global conveyor belt. The chemicals are refined in one country, shipped to another, mixed into ink, and delivered to the packaging plant exactly when the bags need to be printed.
And it assumes nothing will ever go wrong.
It is hyper-efficient, but yes, it assumes a world of perfect peace and uninterrupted logistics.
So a tanker gets threatened in a strait thousands of miles away, and the global conveyor belt stutters. Kelby, printing millions of bags a week, suddenly looks at their inventory and realizes they simply do not have the chemical components to produce the color red anymore.
And they cannot simply pause production to wait for the supply chain to heal.
Because the chips will go bad.
Because their core product, the food inside, has an expiration date. They are forced to execute a total operational pivot, redesigning the printing plates, altering the machinery, and fundamentally changing the visual landscape of the supermarket aisle, all to adapt to a geopolitical shockwave.
It bridges the gap between foreign policy and domestic consumption so clearly.
It forces the citizen to visually confront the reality of the global supply chain crisis every single time they buy a snack.
Okay, so we have just observed how physical supply chains and corporate operations are being stress-tested and altered by these global forces. Now let's examine how the foundational legal architecture of society is being stress-tested.
Right, moving from commerce to law.
We are looking at two distinct legal developments today, one at the constitutional level regarding the survival of the state, and one at the criminal procedure level regarding the rights of the individual citizen.
Basically, the mechanisms of governance when the normal rules fail.
Exactly. Let's start with the Constitution. The House of Representatives Legislative Bureau revealed a draft image for an emergency situation clause to be potentially added to the Constitution.
This is a huge development.
Massive. This draft is designed to address extreme catastrophic scenarios, like a major earthquake or an armed attack, where national elections simply cannot physically be held.
Right.
The draft covers three primary mechanisms. First, it allows for postponing elections and extending the terms of current lawmakers. Second, it outlines methods for maintaining the functions of the Diet, including provisions for online parliamentary sessions.
Which is very modern.
Very. And third, if the Diet simply cannot function at all, it grants the power of emergency cabinet orders and emergency financial dispositions.
So a constitution is fundamentally a document of limitation. It is a rigid framework designed to purposefully restrict the power of the state and mandate a strict adherence to democratic processes, specifically the regular holding of elections.
Right, that's the whole point of a democracy.
But the philosophical conundrum arises when a society encounters an event so catastrophic that adhering to the rigid framework of the Constitution actually guarantees the destruction of the state itself.
Like if Tokyo is totally incapacitated by an earthquake, you cannot legally mandate that citizens go stand in line at a polling station. It's physically impossible. You need a contingency mechanism.
Precisely. The draft clause is an attempt to create a legal architecture for the state to survive when democracy has to temporarily press pause.
Right.
The provision for online diet sessions is a fascinating, necessary modernization, acknowledging that physical assembly might be a biological or structural impossibility. However, the mechanism that will invariably draw the most intense scrutiny is the provision for emergency cabinet orders.
Because that essentially bypasses the legislative branch entirely, right?
Yes, completely.
If the Diet cannot meet, the cabinet is granted the power to make sweeping unilateral decisions and allocate financial resources without any parliamentary debate or approval.
It concentrates the power of the state into a very small group of executives. This is the eternal tension in constitutional law regarding emergency powers.
Because you need them, but they're dangerous.
Exactly. You must empower the executive branch to act with absolute swiftness to save the lives of citizens during a crisis. But history is replete with examples of emergency powers being invoked for a temporary crisis and then normalized into permanent authoritarian overreach.
Right. They never give the power back.
So the debate over this draft will center entirely on the specific friction points. Who exactly gets to define what constitutes an emergency, and what is the exact mechanism for forcing the executive branch to relinquish those powers once the immediate threat has passed?
It is a debate about how to build a firebreak into the system. And while that systemic debate occurs at the highest level of law, there is a fierce, highly specific bureaucratic battle happening today at the Ministry of Justice regarding the Criminal Procedure Code. And this battle is about what happens when the justice system fails the individual citizen. The issue centers on retrials for finalized criminal cases.
The mechanism of correcting a false conviction.
Exactly. Currently, if a person is convicted of a crime, but years later new evidence emerges, perhaps DNA evidence or recanted testimony, and a court decides to grant a retrial to examine the possibility of a false accusation, the prosecutors hold a specific power. They have the right to file an appeal, called a kokoku, to object to the retrial decision.
This is very controversial.
Extremely. Critics, including defense attorneys and human rights advocates, have long argued that prosecutors weaponize these appeals. They use them to endlessly delay the process and prolong the suffering of potentially innocent people, sometimes trapping them in legal limbo for literally decades.
Decades of fighting just to get the retrial.
Right. To address this, the Ministry of Justice is proposing an amendment to ban prosecutors from appealing these retrial decisions.
A ban on appeals represents a profound philosophical shift in how the state views its own infallibility.
But the controversy today isn't actually about the ban itself. It is about the physical placement of the text within the legal document.
The formatting fight.
The formatting fight, yes. On May 7th, the Ministry of Justice proposed placing this ban on appeals into the supplementary provisions of the law, which is called the Fusoku. Lawmakers from the ruling LDP aggressively pushed back against this. They demanded that the ban must be written into the main text of the law, the Hansoku, arguing that this was the only way to ensure it was actually effective.
Right.
So the ministry compromised and is presenting a new plan today. They will delete the wording that allows appeals from the main text entirely and create a new article allowing them only in extremely rare, explicitly defined exceptions.
Which is a big win for the lawmakers.
It is, but I need you to break down the legal mechanics of this for me.
Yeah.
Because to a layperson, the distinction between writing a rule in the main text versus the supplementary provisions sounds like an incredibly pedantic formatting dispute.
I get that.
If the rule is written on the paper, why were lawmakers fighting so fiercely over which section the ink was placed in?
I understand why it appears to be a trivial bureaucratic turf war, but in the realm of statutory drafting, the architecture of the document dictates the fundamental application of the law.
Okay, how?
It is the difference between a core constitutional right and a temporary administrative guideline. Let me delineate the legal weight here. The main text, the Hansoku, is the beating heart of the statute. It establishes the permanent fundamental principles, the core rights, and the primary obligations of the system.
And the supplementary provisions, what do they do?
The supplementary provisions, the Fusoku, are structurally subordinate. They are traditionally utilized for transitional measures, like defining the exact date a new law takes effect, or for minor administrative adjustments necessary to phase in the rules of the main text.
Oh, wow. So placing a massive legal right into the supplementary provisions is essentially minimizing its importance. It's like burying a core policy change in the footnotes of a corporate memo.
It is exactly like that. If the Ministry of Justice placed a principle as monumental as prosecutors can no longer appeal retrials into the supplementary provisions, they would be legally signaling that this is not a core tenet of the Japanese justice system.
Because it's just a footnote.
Exactly. Because supplementary provisions are often viewed as transitional or secondary, a clever prosecutor in the future could potentially argue that the ban was only a temporary measure, or that it could be overridden by broader interpretations of the main text.
Leaving a loophole.
A huge loophole. By forcing the ministry to scrub the right to appeal from the main text entirely, the lawmakers were not arguing about formatting at all. They were demanding an ironclad structural paradigm shift. They are forcing the legal code to explicitly prioritize the swift relief of a potentially innocent citizen over the prosecution's traditional institutional right to endlessly litigate the procedural process.
That makes so much more sense. Both of these legal developments, the constitutional emergency clause and the criminal retrial reform, are fundamentally mechanisms for managing failure.
That's a good way to look at it.
The emergency clause manages the failure of the environment. The retrial reform manages the failure of the human institutions administering justice.
And human failure brings us to the most immediate, visceral impacts we are covering today.
Yeah, the daily news incidents.
We must shift our focus from the abstract architecture of laws and supply chains to the physical reality of society in motion. We are observing a series of incidents today that perfectly illustrate the staggering vulnerability of our physical infrastructure to individual human behavior.
Right. When you look at the news on a micro level, it becomes clear that modern society is an incredibly complex machine running on the assumed baseline that everyone will behave rationally.
And when they don't.
When one person breaks that baseline, the cascading physical effects are enormous. First, we have a really heartbreaking tragedy in Seoul, South Korea. A court has sentenced a man in his 30s to 5 years in prison. Last November, he ran a red light in the Dongdaemun area while driving a vehicle over the legal alcohol limit. He struck a 58-year-old Japanese mother and her 38-year-old daughter who were legally crossing the street on a green light. The mother was killed, and the daughter suffered a severe knee fracture. In handing down the sentence, the court explicitly called it an irreversible tragedy, requiring strict punishment.
It is the most devastating manifestation of the societal contract being broken. We navigate cities assuming the painted lines on the road and the changing colors of the traffic lights provide a shield of safety.
We trust the lights.
A single, profoundly selfish decision to operate a machine while impaired shatters that shield instantly. It permanently alters the trajectory of a family and, in this case, creates an international incident of grief, transforming a family vacation into an irreversible loss.
And that fragility extends beyond human life to the physical arteries of our logistics. In Hokkaido today, around 10:30 a.m., a light passenger car caught fire while driving on the Tokuchi-Okutsk Expressway in Kitami City.
Just a standard car fire.
Yeah, the fire originated in the engine compartment. It took emergency responders 30 minutes to extinguish the blaze. The adult female passenger was injured, though she is conscious and hospitalized. But the systemic impact was that the incident forced the complete closure of the expressway for 3.5 hours.
3.5 hours for a single car fire. This illustrates the concept of architectural bottlenecks perfectly.
Yeah, the whole system just stops.
A highway is designed for massive throughput, but it is a highly constrained physical space. One mechanical failure in one localized engine compartment creates a total blockage. For 3.5 hours, the movement of goods, emergency services, and thousands of other citizens across that region is paralyzed by a single localized fire.
But the most glaring example of a system being paralyzed by localized action occurred on the transit system in Kanagawa Prefecture today.
The Tokaido Line incident.
Yes. A 16-year-old boy from Tokyo was arrested for spraying a substance inside a stopped JR Tokaido line train at Yokohama Station.
It's inside the train.
Inside a crowded commuter train. This single action delayed trains on a massive transit artery for 2 hours and 15 minutes. By the time the train reached Kawasaki Station, passengers were complaining of throat pain, and 3 members of a single family, including a 1-year-old baby girl, had to be hospitalized.
A 1-year-old.
Yeah. The boy admitted to the police that he sprayed the substance, but he claimed he was carrying the spray for self-defense. Police are currently reviewing security camera footage showing 6 people, including the boy, interacting before the incident to understand the full context.
Wow.
I find this incident deeply unsettling. I understand the concept of self-defense, but discharging a chemical irritant inside a crowded, sealed commuter train car demonstrates a terrifying disconnect from reality. The collateral damage is so disproportionate to any perceived individual threat.
It really highlights the inherent vulnerability of open public infrastructure. A commuter train system is a miracle of modern engineering, designed to move millions of people with extreme efficiency. But to achieve that efficiency, it must operate as an open system.
Right, you can't have security checkpoints everywhere.
Exactly. You cannot have airport-style security screening for every passenger boarding a subway at rush hour. The system would just collapse under the friction. Because it is an open system, it relies entirely on the social contract, the assumption that passengers will not introduce biological or chemical hazards into a closed, highly populated environment.
When a 16-year-old makes a split-second poor judgment call, he isn't just defending himself, he is weaponizing the environment.
Yes.
He is turning the ventilation system of the train car against the other passengers.
Precisely. It demonstrates a complete failure to comprehend the physics of the space. A chemical spray in an open field diffuses. A chemical spray in a sealed metal tube concentrates.
It's basically a trap.
The hospitalization of the infant is the tragic, direct result of an individual treating a shared, vulnerable public space as if it were a private vacuum. It is a stark reminder of how easily the complex machinery of a metropolis can be halted by the unpredictable actions of a single actor.
Well, in stark contrast to that chaos and localized disruption, we have one final image from the societal news today that I found incredibly poignant.
The soccer team.
Yes, the North Korean women's soccer team arrived in Beijing today. They're transiting through China, attempting to travel to South Korea to compete in an international tournament. The news footage showed a striking visual. A 30-person squad of elite athletes navigating the airport, and they are seen carrying large boxes of North Korean instant ramen and cold noodles.
Instant noodles.
Yeah, they are currently waiting at the North Korean embassy in Beijing for the South Korean government to issue their entry permits. And if the bureaucratic hurdles are cleared and they win their semifinal match, they could potentially face the Japanese club team, NTV Tokyo Verdy Beleza, in the final.
It is a profound visual juxtaposition that really grounds everything we have discussed today.
It really does.
We began this analysis by examining the massive abstract geopolitical walls being erected and negotiated between global superpowers. We talked about transactional statecraft, economic blockades, and constitutional emergencies. But here, you have a physical manifestation of the human reality trapped between those walls.
It is incredibly humanizing.
Yeah.
You have elite athletes representing a nation largely defined by its extreme isolation and geopolitical friction, walking through a massive international transit hub. And what are they doing? They are carrying boxes of their hometown instant noodles.
A taste of home.
They are bringing a physical comfort from home to sustain them while they wait for diplomats to process the paperwork that dictates whether they are allowed to simply cross a border and play a game of soccer.
It forces us to remember the human scale of geopolitics. The negotiations happening on Air Force One and the supply chain crises in the Middle East ultimately dictate the reality for individuals simply carrying their luggage through an airport, trying to participate in the global community. It bridges the gap between the macro systems of statecraft and the micro-reality of human existence.
That connection between the macro forces of the world and our individual perception of reality brings us to our final topic today.
The tech story.
Yes. After analyzing the heavy mechanics of geopolitics, legal battles, supply chain logistics, and physical infrastructure, I want to end by looking at the ultimate mechanism, the human brain. We're going to examine a piece of technology emerging in Japan that sounds like science fiction, but relies entirely on hacking the neurological way we experience the physical world.
We are discussing the erosion of the boundary between the physical and the digital.
Exactly. So NTT, the massive Japanese telecommunications corporation, has revealed what they're calling the world's first technology that allows a user to physically feel the stickiness and softness of an object without actually touching anything.
Wait, feel it without touching it?
Yeah. There are no haptic gloves, no vibrating controllers, no physical resistance machines. You simply move your empty hands in the empty air in front of a camera.
Okay, the mechanism driving this technology does not rely on generating physical force. It relies on exploiting a specific vulnerability in human neuroscience through optical illusions.
I need you to break down the biology here because my initial reaction is total disbelief. How can moving my fingers through thin air result in a physical sensation of touch?
It sounds impossible.
All right, according to the reports, the system works like this. You look at a screen. On the screen, you see a virtual object, and you see a digital avatar of your own hand interacting with it. If you digitally pinch this virtual object and pull your fingers apart, the software manipulates the visual representation of that action on the screen.
Okay, I'm following.
If the virtual object stretches a long distance across the screen before it visually snaps or breaks, your brain perceives a heavy, thick stickiness, like pulling apart warm mochi. But if the software makes the object visually break very quickly as you pull your fingers apart, your brain tells your fingers that the object is slick and offers no resistance, like oil.
They apply the exact same visual manipulation to convey softness, too. By visually altering how deeply your digital fingers appear to indent the virtual object relative to the speed at which you are pinching, your brain registers the physical sensation of encountering a soft sponge versus a hard rock.
But the physical reality is that my fingers are touching nothing but air. How is it biologically possible that my eyes simply seeing a virtual object stretch on a screen forces my actual physical fingertips to feel resistance?
Well, it is possible because our understanding of how our senses operate is fundamentally flawed.
Oh, really?
Yes, we intuitively believe that our five senses sight, touch, hearing, smell, taste are independent, passive cameras recording objective reality and sending separate data streams to the brain. But neuroscience reveals that the brain does not passively record reality, it actively predicts it.
It predicts it.
Yes, this specific phenomenon relies on a concept called sensory substitution and the dominance of the visual cortex.
So my vision is essentially overriding my sense of touch.
Yes, because your visual cortex processes information exponentially faster than the tactile sensors in your fingertips. Throughout your entire life, your brain has built a massive database of physical physics.
Like, it knows how things work.
Right. It has learned that when it sees a substance stretch significantly before breaking, like melted cheese or mochi, that substance requires physical force to pull apart. Your brain is a prediction engine.
Wow.
When NTT software provides the exact visual cue of heavy stretching on the screen, your brain processes that visual data so quickly that it preloads the expectation of stickiness. It anticipates the resistance before your fingers even have time to confirm it.
That is insane.
The visual prediction is so overwhelmingly strong that the brain essentially hallucinates the tactile sensation, overriding the fact that your fingertips are sending a signal saying we are touching nothing.
That is absolutely staggering. The brain is so desperate for reality to match its visual predictions that it will invent a physical sensation out of thin air. It literally means my eyes are lying to my hands, and my hands are biologically programmed to believe them.
It is a profound vulnerability in our neurological architecture, and NTT is weaponizing that vulnerability for commercial application. Their stated goal is to integrate this technology into e-commerce infrastructure.
Oh, the implications for consumer behavior are massive.
Huge.
If this technology scales, the entire paradigm of online shopping changes. You are no longer just looking at a high-resolution photograph of a sweater and hoping the material is comfortable. You hold your hand up to your webcam, virtually pinch the digital fabric on your screen, and your brain hallucinates the physical softness of the wool.
You could virtually press down on a digital couch cushion to feel its firmness before purchasing it for your living room.
It fundamentally alters the historical limitation of the digital age.
It really does.
For the past 40 years, the digital world has been trapped behind a pane of glass. We can observe it, we can hear it, but we remain physically quarantined from it. This technology, by utilizing neuroscience to bypass the need for physical hardware, represents the first true erosion of that quarantine. It suggests a near future where digital data is not merely consumed, but physically experienced.
It is the perfect mechanism to end our journey today because it brings us full circle.
It really does.
Over the course of this deep dive, we have examined the hidden architecture of the world you woke up to this morning. We started by looking at the towering abstract mechanics of transactional statecraft aboard Air Force One and how nations secure their financial anchors.
Yeah.
We traced how a geographical bottleneck in the Middle East cascades down the global supply chain to physically erase the color from a bag of potato chips in a Tokyo supermarket.
Which is still just wild to me.
We explored how the foundational laws of the state and the physical infrastructure of our transit systems are aggressively stress-tested by catastrophe and human unpredictability. And finally, we looked at how technology is manipulating the neuroscience of your own brain to make you feel objects that do not exist.
So what is the big takeaway from all of this?
The overarching theme connecting all of these disparate data points is the illusion of local reality.
The illusion of local reality.
Okay. We experience our daily lives assuming that our immediate environment, the grocery store we shop in, the train we ride, the physical objects we touch, is a stable, isolated system. But the mechanisms we unpack today reveal that this stability is a projection.
Right.
The physical reality of your local supermarket is entirely dependent on the continuous flow of invisible global forces playing out thousands of miles away. And as we saw with the NTT technology, even the physical sensations in your own fingertips can be a projection of your brain's internal expectations. Keep an eye on your grocery store shelves. They might be the best geopolitical news ticker you have.
It is a profound reminder that the world is infinitely more interconnected and infinitely more fragile than it appears on the surface. Understanding the news is not about memorizing a list of events. It is about recognizing the deep, complex mechanisms that govern those events.
Exactly.
We hope we helped you see some of that underlying scaffolding today. Thank you for taking the time to explore these systems with us, and we will continue the exploration on the next deep dive.